the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at onscriptpodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/onscript.
Hello, OnScript listeners. Welcome back for another tantalizing episode of the OnScript podcast featuring new and noteworthy publications in biblical studies. I'm Matt Lynch, coming to you from Westminster Theological Center in the UK, where I am based, and I co-host the podcast with Matt Bates, Dru Johnson, Aaron Heim, and Chris Tilling. Before we kick it off, I want to quickly say two things. First of all, thanks again to Ed Hatke for all his help producing these episodes every 2 weeks. Ed has been super helpful, and we couldn't do this without you, Ed. Thank you. Also, thanks to Tommy Mullman for all his help with marketing and OnScript evangelism. If you have enjoyed OnScript, could you please turn to the person next to you at work and let them know about us? Or if you're at home, let your family know about us. Help spread the word, perhaps by wearing one of those sandwich boards, and if you do, send a pic, by the way, or flying a plane with one of those signs behind it, or maybe planting bushes in the shape of the words OnScript. We appreciate your help and support with that. Enjoy this one with Joshua Berman, interviewed by Dru Johnson. Here we go.
Welcome, OnScript superfans. This is Dru Johnson coming to you from Chicago, Illinois, where I'm doing a visiting fellowship at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I'm joined today all the way from Israel by the Rabbi, Dr. Joshua Berman. Dr. Berman is an associate professor at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. His books include Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought in the Temple by Oxford University Press, and the book we're going to be discussing today, Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Source Criticism. Dr. Berman is an ordained Orthodox rabbi, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Religion from Princeton University in the United States and Ph.D. in Bible from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, where he now teaches. Welcome to OnScript, Dr. Berman.
Oh, thank you, Dru, and blessings to all of our audience from the Holy Land.
Well, first and foremost, I want to note to our audience something they can't see, but if you can imagine with me, there's lots of kinds of hardback books that are made in the world, but I noticed this one is actually made in the United States. It was the first thing I noticed about the book, that this book is very well made, like physically. And so I wondered if you negotiated that in advance, or that just happens to be what Oxford did for you.
Oh my gosh, that's so interesting because I think that most of the work on the book was done on the eastern coast of India. That's certainly all the production people that I dealt with it's all outsourced. So it's interesting how that's different than my previous work with Oxford, where everything was done in their North Carolina operation. But now I guess they parcel it out. They have editorial offices in New York and do most of the production in India, and then the binding itself. I didn't even know that. Gee, I've learned about my book from you already, Dru, things that I didn't know.
It looks like it was made to last, which I think is a good sign. So as I was reading this book, it became clear to me that it felt like a project that had been boiling for years and stewing. So I wonder how this particular book project came about, and how long had this book been in the making, in your mind at least?
Wow. Yes, boiling and stewing is correct, and I would say about 8 or 9 years in the making. Look, it's really something that's very existential for me, and maybe also for many of our listening audience. And that is that, you know, when you're given certain truths that you study in piety when you're younger, if you come from religious orientation as I do, and then you come up against critical thought and critical conclusions when you get to university, and then you have to build that bridge. And that requires, for many of us, kind of theological calisthenics, philosophical calisthenics, and that's all important. And what flex room there might be within our various catechisms, all that's really important, and I've gone through that too. But there's a missing part of building the bridge, and that is turning a critical eye on the criticism itself. That is the foundational, I would say, zeitgeist my work here.
And well, maybe we'll come back to that turning the critical eye on the criticism itself, because that is central to what the book is doing. How would you say that you're Orthodox? So it's one thing to be Orthodox Jew. It's another thing to be Orthodox Jew in the land of Israel. And you're American by birth. Is that correct?
It's true.
Okay. So I wonder if you have any sense about how your Orthodox faith feeds into your scholarship, or is it something that, you hear lots of people say, well, I kind of set it aside when I do my textual work. And
I don't set it aside.
Okay. And how do you see it informing your, like specifically, maybe even yeshiva training or something, and informing the way you do your biblical criticism?
Okay, first of all, everything that I do, I mean, I strive for this in my life as an Orthodox Jew, should be in some form or everything that I do should be in some form or fashion a service of the Almighty. And so therefore, what I do from 9 to 5, and of course, as an academic, it's much past 5, it's pretty much around the clock, I view it as a religious calling, and that's where it starts. Secondly, it influences my scholarship in that existentially, my entire academic life and intellectual life as an adult has been an effort to find the ways to build these bridges, how I can have both spiritual integrity and intellectual integrity coming together. And I would say that what comes out in this book is that sometimes I feel that I look in places maybe where others have not looked before. And so I think and I will tell you that the work that I find gets the greatest praise from individuals in the Guild of Biblical Scholars who do not share my faith orientation is precisely these issues where I've perhaps looked under some stones here or there that people hadn't thought to look under before. And oftentimes my motivation is, my Orthodox orientation says that there's cohesion or cohesiveness in this text. How can we find that? It's so clear to our modern eyes that it's not cohesive. Well, from a different angle, from ancient Near Eastern ways of thinking or writing, and often it's that angle looking for, is there another way to see cohesion here when our modern perspectives don't allow that cohesion to be seen? And that's driven by my desire to find this type of bridge. That's what's led me sometimes to some of these insights.
Yeah, and I think you did a wonderful job in the book kind of exploring the modern mindset, and we'll talk about that more when we get to legal code. But that there is an etymology, as it were, as to why we think about these things the way we do, and it's fairly recent, which itself deserves a critical lens. Just the novelness of the way we think about these things. So I think
let me say, Drew, that the flip side of it, obviously, is that anybody who comes with a kind of a religious orientation, certain set of truths that they might have been taught when they're younger, if they want to be involved in this pursuit, the academic pursuit, according to academic rules, then they also have to police themselves. They have to know what are the rules of the game, etc. So it's obviously not just as simple as coming with a big truck of all my Orthodox belief and dump, because that wouldn't be accepted in scholarship, and it wouldn't be acceptable to me as well. There are just truths out there. 600,000 males of fighting age coming out of Egypt. A modern person has to deal with that. Every Orthodox person, I think, has to deal with that. So it's, yeah.
Well, and I think it's good because I know we have a lot of grad students who listen to this podcast. And sometimes they'll ask, well, how did you get to the point where you could say these things so boldly? And I think it's worth saying that you do have to put your time and your work in to the point where you can earn the right to be heard. And when you speak, you can say the things that you feel that you've criticized well enough. Okay, well, getting to the premise of the book then, I think the chief premise, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is basically biblical scholars haven't ever really done comparative literary work between the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East.
Well, there's been much comparative work, but
so they're not doing the right kind of comparative work among the, so I know most of our listeners will hear, well, comparative biblical work with the ancient Near East, of course, we have parallelomania, it went off the hook for a while, right?
Yeah.
So what's the kind of literary comparative work that you're actually, that you wish we saw more of?
Yeah, well, what I've really tried to do in this work is to examine the notion of cohesion, or its flip side, fissure, where we have, by virtue of the fact that we are modern Aristotelians, all of us, doesn't matter whether you're in Israel or America or Orthodox Jew or evangelical, we're all Aristotelians, and it's Aristotle that has seeped down into all of us. In our conceptions as to what cohesion, what cohesiveness means, how a piece of literature holds together. And what I've tried to do is to say, or is to see, how sometimes we are stuck in the fishbowl of our own first assumptions. And is it necessarily true that ancient writers, especially in the ancient Near East and in ancient Israel, were they also Aristotelians? Or can we find compositions written in the ancient world where we see that the things that we take for granted as surefire signs of fissure weren't so to them, and they turn up all in many, many surprising places?
Yeah, so one of those you cite out of the gates is the Kadesh stelas, which I forget which pharaoh is the one who erected those.
Ramses II.
Ramses II, yeah. How could I forget that one? And you say, and this was actually, sometimes the facts are the most shocking things, that it's probably one of the most well-known documents in the ancient Near East, given its promulgation and that it was recreated and put along the coast of Canaan as well. So how does that serve as an example to your point that you have signs of fissure, signs of cohesion, and you're saying that actually from an Egyptian stela writing campaign, because it wasn't just a stela they were making, it was actually multiple accounts. Right. But within that stela, right, you might see signs of what we would classically call fissure, but you say, no, cohesion is fine for them. So how does that example work?
Yeah, let me just give a little bit of background for perhaps listeners that aren't familiar with this. So Ramses II, Ramses the Great, he rules for about 80 years in the 13th century BCE. He is the greatest pharaoh of the greatest period of ancient Egyptian history, the New Kingdom. And his greatest accomplishment was a battle that he had against his arch rival, the Hittite Empire, in 1274 BCE at a place called Kadesh, which is on the Lebanese-Syrian border at the Orontes River. Scholars think that this was the largest chariot battle in all of history, based on the descriptions from both sides. Who won? Well, it depends who you ask. The Hittites seem to think that they got out of it okay. The Egyptians think that they won. I'm not interested in hearing what actually happened. What I'm interested in is, what does Ramses do when he gets home to Egypt? And what he does is that he plasters Egypt. We know of at least 10 different copies all over Egypt that he put up accounts of this battle. That makes the Battle of Kadesh the most publicized event of any period in the ancient history, including in Greece and Rome. These 10 copies all over Egypt. Some are in monumental structures. Some are in papyri that we have found in rather mundane sites, like amongst working people, the people who would like do the masonry at Thebes. Now, here's what's really remarkable about he puts up in, I think, 7 or 8 different places that we know about, multiple accounts of what happened. Usually 3. There's a longer account, often called the poem, a shorter account that we would identify in our terms more as prose, and then reliefs, like comics, almost, with little inscriptions under them. And when you look at these three, accounts, they don't line up. There's just they contradict one another. It's very hard to mesh them, and they seem to have different emphases, and they celebrate different not just different moments in the battle. Who's the real hero? Is the real hero the god? Is the real hero the king? Is the real hero the Na'arin brigade that seems to have excelled in what they did? And what comes out is that if you just you would never think that all 3 of these could have been written at one time by one king, or commissioned by one king. But we know, by virtue of the fact that they are at a monumental site, you can't just suddenly add blank wall. You build a huge wall and you figure out, what am I going to put here? What am I going to put here? So it's clear that all of these are commissioned at one time together, and they are composed together. in spite of all the seeming fissures between them. And then the longest of them, the poem, has what we would identify as fissures within it itself.
Yeah, and so if that were just a papyrus that was found, would it be more controversial? I mean, it's the fact that we have actual physical material, stone form, where it's not debatable that these were written at the same time. Okay.
That's right. There is absolute unanimity across all Egyptologists that all of these were inscribed at the same time. Some say it was a few years after the war, some say it was 20 years after, but that's immaterial. What is important for us is that they are all composed simultaneously.
So this just dredges up the issue of looking for fissures might be a false hunt, or there's no way to guarantee that it's not a false hunt.
Fishing for fissures.
Fishing for fissures.
No, it's inevitable. I mean, there are fissures. But what I'm saying is we might not have the keys to the car to do the work that we want to do. To reconstruct the textual history of the biblical text requires that we have all of the keys. In other words, if you can identify a few fissures here and there accurately, but you're missing the keys, you're thinking that there's fissure where there isn't in just a few places, that really throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing.
Yeah, so it's not the idea that there are various sources that are sometimes being threaded together in the Torah that's being questioned. It's how accurately you can assess those sources. I don't think anybody argues about editorial remarks in the Torah or that various stories are told from different perspectives.
Well, that's part of what I'm trying to say, is that when stories are told from different perspectives, that is not necessarily an indication of either multiple authorship or even a desire by one side to delegitimize the previous telling. In fact, this is what Egyptologists say about the Kaddish inscriptions. Forget about what Berman says about them. What Egyptologists say. Gardner, the famous Egyptologist, he said, well, it must be that what we have here is that there's multiple tellings of what happened at the Battle of Kadesh to tell us different aspects about it. And sometimes that results in facts that don't fit together. And you can clearly see there's three accounts. One account, praises, is focused on the role of the god Amun in the salvation of Kadesh. One of the accounts is focused on the exploits of Ramses II. And the third composition is focused on the exploits of this particular brigade that excelled in the field of battle. And there seems to be no compuncture whatsoever about, well, but the details don't line up, and this contradicts. No, because each one is its own telling. And each one has its own message, and each one is adopted on its own for its own message.
Yeah, and in that case, it's at least pure description, and there's the question of, is it also being prescriptive? Is it trying to do something towards particular audiences in each telling? And that may be off limits for us to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think Egyptologists are still trying to figure this out, not just about the Kaddish inscriptions, but really just about monumental inscriptions generally. Are these for the gods? Are these for the intellectual elite? When you have reliefs, are those for the common people? Well, this is a big question that's certainly beyond my.
Yeah, and I think we're really talking about. It's funny because I feel like a lot of if I were to go in an evangelical church and ask people, like, well, how do you explain the difference between this Deuteronomic telling of the story of the Sinai and the Exodus telling? I think they would give a very similar answer, like, well, it's different audience. They're trying to do something differently with it. I think that would probably boil down to where people would end up going, yeah, they're different, but they're emphasizing different things for different purposes. So in some ways, it seems like a very common sense explanation. Once you accept the fact that there's some unanimity or cohesion, as you've been saying, to the text. Okay, so let's turn to legal text for a second. And you make the case that basically, again, the approach you bring to the text kind of determines the outcome. All data is theory-laden, as they say. And you make the case that basically we're bringing tort law statutory concepts to these biblical legal texts, and especially where laws seem to overwrite each other or contradict each other. And you make the case that it should be viewed as common law. So can you just very briefly give us a thumbnail sketch of the difference between statutory and common law?
Okay, let's think about the following sentences that we use all the time that employ this simple three-letter word, law, okay? To pass a law. This was done according to the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. When we speak in those terms, we all have in mind implicitly even without thinking. It's just obvious to us that the law that we're speaking of when we speak of, the legislature passed a law, what you did is according to the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law, that the law is contained in a written formulation, in a law code. We all have law codes. Everything we do in our civic life is according to law codes. That understanding of law, that it must be something that's very carefully written, and jurists pored over it, and the likes of you and me, Drew, we would never want to have to interpret law by ourselves. We get a lawyer anytime we have anything, buy a house, whatever it is, because who knows? It's not natural language. It's this specialized language. Okay, that whole way of viewing law as carefully formulated prescriptions, laid out one section carefully after another, this is what we call statutory law. And it's very, very intuitive to all of us, because anybody who's listening to this podcast lives in a world that is ruled by such a notion of law. But it has absolutely nothing to do with how people thought about norms, right and wrong, what is permitted, what is prohibited in the ancient world. There is no word for law in this sense anywhere in the ancient world. I mean, in Greece, starting in the 5th century, but certainly in the ancient Near East, none of these cultures have that. Was everything lawless? Were people just doing whatever they wanted to do? No, what went on in the ancient world is that right and wrong was something that was very natural. Think of what goes on in your own home, okay? You have a home. You have children in your home. Is there right and wrong? Of course, all the time we're lecturing our kids about right and wrong. Okay? But nobody has on the side of their refrigerator the laws of the living room, the laws of the couch. Section 1, thou shalt not jump up and down on the couch. Thou shalt not eat on the couch. Or if you want to drink on the couch, then you have to consult a competent authority. We don't have that. It's not posted on the fridge. It's lived. It's modeled. Mommy and daddy do it. The neighbors do it. This is how children learn right and wrong. This is how communities in the ancient times knew what was right and wrong. Everybody's doing it. Everyone's on the same page. And so this idea that you had to write down law was entirely foreign. Now, what was it that precipitated this massive mind switch such that today you and me and everybody listening to this podcast thinks about law as written? So I talk about that in the book, and if you want, we can talk about that too. But it means that when we see things that look like a law code, they sound like a law code, here the law of duck doesn't work. It might look like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's not a duck. It looks like a law code, it reads like a law code, it gives punishments like a law code, it's not a law code. This is what scholars have concluded, certainly about the misnomer Code of Hammurabi, which is now called the Laws of Hammurabi, but that doesn't really solve anything much either. This is all a perfect example of how we take a modern notion, which is so intuitive to us that we can't imagine that anyone ever thought otherwise, and impose it on the ancients, and thereby wind up misunderstanding a heck of a lot of things.
Yeah, I think the code or the law of Hammurabi is a great example, because I think almost everybody knows about it. I mean, there's a relief of Hammurabi in the U.S. Supreme Court, and yet, as my Assyriologist friends like to point out, and I think you point out in the book as well, there's not a single legal decision that ever cites or alludes to the Code of Hammurabi. So it's just used in a different. The laws are used in a different way. It seems that the common law argument is that it's used in a historical way. Precedents are set. Which means you have to recite some of the laws and how they've changed over time as well to show the precedents. And that's you use this. I thought it was a really good example. It's so simple, it's obvious, but you use the U.S. Constitution as a model for how this legal thinking might have happened. So I did a little legal theory philosophy class, and I was looking at the statutes of murder in the state of Missouri, where I was at the time, just for a paper I was working on. And I had not realized at the time this simple fact that when they change what counts as murder, they don't keep the old law in there. You just see the new iteration in the legal code. So you don't realize that all kinds of different definitions of murder preceded this in the state of Missouri. Mm-hmm. So how does the U.S. Constitution compare to what you think is going on in the Torah and other places as well?
Okay. Let me give some concrete examples from within the Torah, and then we'll see how understanding constitutional law really is very, very edifying here. In Exodus 12, we're given one set of instructions about how to offer the Paschal sacrifice. And then you come to Deuteronomy 16, and it gives a totally different set of instructions about how to go about offering the Paschal sacrifice. You can't do both.
And this is fire versus boiling, or roasting versus boiling.
Fire versus boiling, and a whole bunch of other things having to do with sprinkling the blood and fire. Yeah, whether it's roasted or boiled is the main one. Where it's done, is it done in your backyard, or is it done only in the central shrine? There's a whole bunch of differences. They're not both operative. They can't both be done. And it would appear at first blush that if you consider the Torah to be a cohesive whole, that there is a blatant contradiction about what you do with the Paschal sacrifice. So you can try all sorts of elegant ways of harmonization. Oh, this word doesn't really mean this. That doesn't work. It doesn't really work. But it's still a cohesive whole. And this is how we can understand how you can have different iterations of the same law carried out vastly different ways, and it's not a contradiction. You look at the U.S. Constitution. Let me explain what I mean by this. All constitutions the world over, the founders of those respective states always knew that over time things are going to change. And there needs to be a mechanism in place for future generations to change what it says in the Constitution. In most places, in most countries in Europe, and in almost all the states of the Union, of the United States, the procedure is very simple. When the legislature has enough votes to enact a change, the change is voted on, and then the Constitution is rewritten now to accord with the new change. So that at any one moment, if you were to go to your state legislature and ask to look at the Constitution, what you would be getting is what it looks like in 2018. You would not know about anything that had happened earlier. You would be given exactly what is the law that we are living right now. And that makes total sense. Except that the founders of the U.S. Constitution took a different tack. As we all know, the U.S. Constitution, when there's a change made, it's called an amendment. It's tacked on at the end. That is to say that the original Constitution, founded in, 1787 or whatever it was, that original text never changes. When there are amendments, then the amendments are tacked on. And the amendments themselves can be contradictory. So you have the beginning of Prohibition, and then you have, I think, 2 amendments later, the end of Prohibition. And the way in which some scholars look at this is that it allows for the textual integrity of the original text to remain, and it also allows readers to see, because the amendments are always dated, you see what the flow is over time. You see how things are developing. If you know the dates and you know the context that's around them, then that helps you understand why this amendment was put in at this time and this amendment at this time. This is how we need to understand law in Deuteronomy over against earlier iterations of those laws. So Deuteronomy, looking at what will life be like when Israelites enter the land of Israel, well, there's going to be central worship. There's no longer going to be people doing all their altars or high places in their own backyards. So we're going to reshape how the Paschal sacrifice is offered. The iteration of the law in Exodus 13 is kept on the books, not because that's necessarily the one that's operative, but because what the Torah is doing is showing you what was Israel's law as it moved throughout this whole period. It is a truth about all the laws that are in the Torah, that they are always dated, they're always situated, not just textually, but chronologically. You know, were these given at Sinai? Were these given during the wandering? Were these given in the 40th year? And that tells you so much about what it is the Torah wants to say about each law. And so you see an evolution, and this is how different iterations of the law can now be seen as part of one whole that actually holds together.
Yeah, I thought that was a very helpful account that you gave in the book. And then one of the nice things about the book also is the chapters are very short often. So you have some good explanation and then a few short test cases, which are very helpful. There's also, which we don't need to get into it here, but I think the discussion of narrative and law, there's lots of people who've been working in how narratives are displaying some of the law being worked out. Jonathan Burnside, I know, has done some work on that as well. And I thought you took some interesting approach with Ruth as well, which I think is worth reading for all those who are listening. I want to get back to the documentary hypothesis and that kind of general source criticism bent. As you point out in the book, that the most famous or infamous case of documentary hypothesis, the one that kind of seals the deal, is the Noahic account of the flood in Genesis 6-9. Actually, I have a friend who he points to that as the reason he finally could buy into the documentary hypothesis, when someone showed him how you could pull those two accounts apart. So, you make a case based on chiasmus, among other things, but you make a more basic common sense appeal that there's a problem with that thinking at the outset. And if I have it correct, is what's the problem with appealing to a parallel narrative in Mesopotamia while simultaneously appealing to multiple sources behind the story of the flood?
I don't catch what. Say again. Yeah.
Well, the idea is, in one sense, you want to say the flood resembles these Mesopotamian accounts so closely, and at the same time, you want to be able to say, but they're actually two different accounts under the biblical account. There's two different sources undergirding the two.
I don't think they're two different sources undergirding.
Okay, so what would be the problem with espousing that, I guess?
Oh, I think that the source critical approach to the flood story, as I point out in the book, I think it suffers from no fewer than 8 methodological flaws. Some of the, it'd be difficult to go through all 8 of them now, but
yeah, we don't need to.
Right. Some of my I'll throw out what I think is one of my favorites, and that is that we have no evidence of from any other ancient Near Eastern texts of people bringing together sources in this way to create such a mess when you read it. In other words, you have the Diatessaron, but that was exactly the opposite. You had the 4 Gospels, and Tatian wanted to create one seamless whole, and it's pretty seamless. But this doesn't achieve that. Now, source critics fully admit that what we do have here in Genesis 6-9 are not full original accounts. The priestly account, so-called priestly account, is longer, but they all admit the so-called non-priestly account must have been much longer. So then what we know from that, by their own admission, is that redactors did not retain full fidelity to their original texts. They were ready to cut stuff out. Once you say that they were ready to cut stuff out, how do you know that they never changed anything along the way? If they don't have fidelity to the original text, maybe in final redaction, they did some things of their own. And no source critic can allow that to ever be said. Because once you're ready to admit that maybe a redactor, editor, whatever you want to call him, had original source material and not only cut down, but also changed some of the original language, or maybe a lot of the original language, in order to create the text before us, that shuts down the barn. That means that there's no possibility anymore for us to recreate what the original texts looked like. That would put source criticism out of business.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that example, and like you said, you had 8 or 9 methodological issues that you took up with that. I think as you walk through those, it becomes clear how much trepidation you should have in working through that method. And then the question becomes, well, what's the better method? What are our alternatives? And at the end of the book, you basically appeal. The book as a whole is kind of a detailed appeal for epistemological humility, which I think all scholars claim to appeal to that. I don't know anybody who's never. But there's a further appeal here to methodological controls. Maybe not a null hypothesis, but can you find parallel examples of the literary work that's going on in the text here? So I guess, just like down to brass tacks, if somebody's reading this text, and there was a discussion in your Mosaic Symposium, not exactly on the topic of the book, but it was some overlay with what's going on in the book. Best case scenario, someone who is really deep into source criticism, really trying to give exact accounts of the history and the text of each little part of the text. They read your book. What's the best case scenario outcome that you see coming from them taking the book seriously?
Oh, wow.
Besides a spiritual awakening and saying, I see everything Bermanly now, or...
No, that's not going to happen. I know that's not going to happen. I commented to a colleague of mine recently that I think that a prerequisite for promotion in academia should be that the promotion board asks you, list us the things about which you have changed your opinion during your scholarly career. I think it's really, really important, and I think it doesn't happen enough. I think, look, it's just human nature, and Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn told us, people who've been trained in one way, and there's a paradigm, and even when there's begin to be problems with the paradigm, until a new paradigm comes along that irons everything out, they're going to stick to where they are. So I would say younger students, people, grad students that are training, that are maybe looking at all the issues with fresh eyes. I think that's important. I think it's also really, really important that there's a lot of people who are kind of on the fence about a lot of these issues. I discover they're not vocal because, by virtue of the fact that they're on the fence, means that they're not sure what to say, so they don't talk about this all that much. So I don't have any delusions about suddenly converting the whole scholarly guild, just like I'm sure that I'm sort of stuck in some things, some convictions and academic premises that I have that others would say, gosh, he's just irredeemably lost in his first assumption. So, but so I think younger students, and I think also what I'm hoping is that that this work will be something that will stimulate other scholars who are looking to build the bridges that I am, especially between what tradition says and what criticism says, and to view that as a worthy endeavor, to view it as one that has opportunities for outcomes that are different than what we have today. That yes, it's important to examine, our catechisms, and is there flexibility there? For sure, that's important. But that there's so much important work to be done out there, especially by getting in touch with ancient Near Eastern writings, ancient Near Eastern way of thinking about things, much more than has been done. And I would say that if there's one thing that I really wanted to appeal here on this broad platform with which you have blessed me, is to address myself to folks who are studying in seminary, who maybe already have a little bit of an affinity, they like it, they've got that spark about studying ancient languages. And maybe they're thinking, it's nice to study this, but I wanna save people's souls. I want to do pastoral work. That's serving the Lord. I get that. I'm a rabbi. I also I also enjoy pastoral work and all that. But what I want to tell seminarians who are kind of on that fence is that you don't know how much good you can do for people by engaging in this very detailed, thorough intellectual work. I mean, my inbox is full. I get a constant stream of questions, Jews and non-Jews alike. Oh, how do I reconcile this? What do you do? Is there another way of looking at it? So that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can be a scholar and you can still be doing work that's beneficial for people's spiritual well-being. And I think that that this foundational idea that there's so much in critical method, which is really anachronistic, which is from where we are in ways that we just have no idea that maybe once upon a time things were different. And uncovering that is so exciting, and I really want to invite as many people as possible to come join us in this very exciting, very important work.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that academia is such a weird landscape, especially biblical studies. I mean, even when I talk to my friends who do other kinds of scholarship, I think it's important to note that if you do a lot of really hard work over the years to make the case, sometimes the best outcome is that you continue the conversation, that you get people to stay in the conversation and to think more about it. It's not that you're converting people to this wonderful thing that you've seen that nobody else has. So even, epistemological humility has to be had even in the aims of people who have radical research agendas, right? Okay, I'm really interested to know. So the book's been out for about a year now. Is that right? I'm interested to know from your perspective how are you taking it on the chin? How have been the responses, and what do you think are the most significant responses that have challenged you? What would you say those were?
Wow, a lot of responses come out these days on social media. And they're kind of in-house discussions. So if you're part of the right Facebook group, then you're privy to those. And if you're not, so I'm sure that there are many discussions about the book that I'm not privy to. I know that there have been 4 reviews that I've come across. They've all been positive. I think people are just intrigued by discovering the degree to which there are a whole series of anachronistic presuppositions that undergird a lot of our scholarship.
So you don't feel like there's some scholar out there who's writing a book proposal right now titled "Inconsistencies in Berman"? Why he's gotten it all wrong.
Drew, as you know, okay, so the book has been out now for about 15 months. In the life of a book and its reception, that's a blink. The book comes out. It's not a short book. It takes a while to read. Someone writes an intelligent assessment of it until it's published. Do you know what I mean? So it's hard. It's hard to say. So we'll see. We'll see where it goes. I think I'll just Let me talk about not my own work, but what I suspect will happen. Okay, there's a very prominent scholar whose work has had a very great influence on me, named Gordon Wenham. He's in the UK. He's an Old Testament scholar in the UK. He wrote an article in Vetus Testamentum, one of the most important journals in the field, in the late 70s, about the flood, in which he showed that the Genesis flood account follows 15 or 17 parallel developments of plot to the Mesopotamian flood account in the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. Really, it's one after the other, without any gaps, and it's just remarkable how little attention that article has been given by source critics. What I mean to say by all this is that people work within their own first assumptions. So if you want to talk about how to spice up Genesis 6-9, then that gets read by all the people who do that. If you want to claim, using academic critical methodology, that, there seems to be a cohesiveness here and we can control for that by what we see in the Mesopotamian flood epic, well, then those that are looking to splice the text usually don't even cite it, let alone engage with its claims. So I'm sure that for some, my book, we just don't do what Berman does. So we do other things. Just like probably I also ignore certain things that go on out there. So we'll see. We'll see. I'll know that that the book is doing well when it begins to have serious critics. That's what I would say. Yeah.
That's a good way to put it. Okay, well, at the end here, we're going to do the speed round all in one shot. So I have quite a few questions here for you that you're meant to answer very quickly if you can. And I'll give you more time where you need to on a few of them. But are you ready for the speed round?
Here we go. Yes.
All right.
Shoot.
In just a few sentences, how does one become a rabbi?
Wow. How does one become a rabbi? One studies a certain set of texts and usually gets tested on a certain amount of material. There's kind of a standard curriculum. And when you pass those tests by an agency or by a rabbi that's recognized, then you become a rabbi. I'm talking here about Orthodox ordination, which is what
of
I
course.
have. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, and that set of texts is going to be the Talmud, right? And the Mishnah.
Though I just have to share an anecdote. I think this will really complement. We at Bar-Ilan, we're blessed to have now a large contingent of South Korean graduate students who come to us to study, to really learn modern Hebrew, and biblical studies. And I was speaking with one of them recently, and he asked me exactly that question. He says, "Oh, you're a rabbi, and how do you become a rabbi?" And I explained to him the courses of study and the tests, and then he said to me, "I want to be a rabbi." So, maybe we'll have our first South Korean evangelical rabbi. I don't know, but yeah. So, it's a testament to a testimony to their appreciation of wisdom and mentorship, and that's
it is slightly different than a lot of the Protestant and Roman Catholic ways of becoming ordained. I mean, there's similarities and there's definite difference. One main difference is, I think, the idea in Orthodoxy you kind of become ordained under another rabbi, rather than kind of a denomination.
Yeah, in fact, the word for ordination in Hebrew, smicha, putting hands on top, it's taken from the Bible.
From samach.
That's right, that's right. In other words, just like a person would put their hands on the animal's head, sort of transfer their identity to the animal that was going to be sacrificed. So one mentor or rabbi confers his status onto the underling.
Just like Numbers 27 with Moses and Joshua, right?
Yes, exactly. Correct.
Okay. Second question. Do you know Krav Maga?
Wow, I do not. I have served in the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, but my service was a little different than what you might read about in exciting books about the Mossad, because I made Aliyah at the age of 23. And then I got married and had a baby. By the time they got around to me, I was 29, and I did a very shortened service. So I got around to driving a Jeep. That's what they had me doing, but none of the Krav Maga stuff.
What they're standing around like, what are we going to do with Berman? Give him the keys to the Jeep. Yeah, that's basically my military service as well. This is going to be a Talmudic question. Since you're a rabbi, I have to ask you at least one opinion. And we'll see if we get three answers. Do you agree or disagree with Reb Eliezer on his assessment that Adam had sex with all the animals in order to figure out that Eve was his proper mate?
Look, I mean, like all midrash, I take midrash as looking as exhortative, as looking to convey ideas, not as literal historical accounts.
Okay. Oh wow. So we got an answer and an interpretive key here. All right. Good. Have you ever met a European or an American Christian who has like a dysfunctional obsession with Israel and all things Jewish?
What do you mean by dysfunctional?
I mean, like they're obsessed in a way that might border on unhealthy.
I mean, I have been blessed to meet many, many people that love the Jewish people and love the state of Israel. And what I have found is that the farther I travel from Israel, the more that is true. So that when I traveled to Fiji a few years ago, being a Bible scholar is a great thing, and I'll tell you why. It's because your institution often will pay for you to speak in any academic setting where your discipline is taught. It just turns out that there are more Bible colleges on the face of the earth than any other academic discipline. So if you're into diving like I am, then you can go to a place like Fiji, and I could spend Shabbat with Seventh Day Adventists and have a beautiful Shabbat experience with not a Jew in sight for 1,700 miles, and then the next day go diving. So this combination of spreading the word of the Lord and diving to the depths of the sea, I call my Jonah project, because it kind of meshes it all together. And what I discover is that, people that have never seen a Jew before, you arrive in Fiji and you're Jewish and you're from the Holy Land. Boy, I mean, I really had to remind myself, that a few pills of humility was definitely in need.
Well, that pairs nicely with this next question. Is for those that don't,
I just have to add one thing about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as I was receiving this incredible reception in Fiji, I thought to myself, a man is never a prophet in his own city. I thought that line. And I thought to myself, where's that from? Where's that from? Because it's thrown around in Hebrew all the time. Wait, Drew, you got to hear this.
I know exactly where it's from.
It's thrown around in Hebrew all the time. And I said, you see, Berman, you say to yourself, En Navi be'iro. There's no man who's a prophet in his own city, which is clearly from the Bible. And you can't even remember which prophet of Israel said that. The next morning there, as I'm spending Sabbath with the Seventh Day Adventists on the largest island in Fiji, I decided to attend the Bible study session that they had there. And they opened their New Testaments, which I don't get to read very often. And I see there, Jesus says, there's no man who's a prophet in his own city. I said, oh, that's where it's from. I didn't know that. So I got the dose of humility that I was really needing.
If it makes you feel any better, I play a game in my class, my Introduction to Hebrew Scripture, where I say, who said this, right? And I'll say, love your neighbor as yourself. And everybody's always guessing Jesus or Paul, and I'm like, nope, Moses, nope, no Moses.
And so, Leviticus, no less.
Yes, exactly. Leviticus 19, one of the best chapters, yeah. Okay, so for those who don't know anything about Israel, could you just briefly describe the average Israeli's relationship to the practice of the Torah? The average Israeli.
We're spread all over the whole spectrum. It's a whole spectrum. 20% of Israeli Jews are observant. That means like Sabbath observant, and kosher observant. What you would think of when you think of as an observant Jew. There's a huge gray area in the middle of people who do a little bit, but and then there are some that are secular that do nothing. But I would say that over time, what's happening is that once upon a time, there was a really staunch, secular, anti-religious. We're here to uproot all that came before and create the new secular kibbutz Jew. That's kind of gone by the wayside together with the kibbutz. And there's a kind of return today to try to re-engage tradition that's really very fascinating. And, there's some things that are kind of universal. The idea of sitting down with the family at Friday night dinner is in almost every Israeli household. So that there's certain things from the tradition that seep down really deep into all sectors of the society.
Okay.
Yom Kippur, which is tomorrow night. By the time this is aired, it'll be past that. But Yom Kippur, you can go out onto the largest superhighways that we have, and there is nothing, not a car.
Do you watch Fauda?
I don't. What is that?
Oh, it's an Israeli television show. It's huge over here in the United States. It's on Netflix.
We don't have a TV.
Oh, it's on Netflix only. But then I'm not going to ask you the next question if Leo Raz is svelte in person. Okay, if modern biblical criticism were a movie, what would be the title?
I have to be careful here, Drew. Well, I would like to think that the parts that I critique in my book would be called The Towering Inferno.
Oh, I remember that movie.
I haven't seen a lot of movies since my childhood, so that's my touchstone. But we'll see.
I very vividly remember that movie from my childhood. Okay, controversial question. Do you share Jesus' name, or do you think it was actually Yeshua? So do you think Jesus was actually called Yehoshua or Yeshua?
I don't know enough about New Testament scholarship to answer that.
There is a group of people that really want it to be Yeshua.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know why. Okay, let me ask you a harder name, and you can come back to that one, or a harder question.
I'll just say my father's Hebrew name is the son of Jacob, Gad, G-A-D. G-A-D. Pronounced in Hebrew, God. Right? In Hebrew, you don't say Gad, you say God. And so I've been the butt of some jokes about Yoshua, son of God. But I deny it. And I have, unfortunately, I don't have any intelligent response to whether Jesus' name originally was Yeshua or Yehoshua.
That's okay. I've heard of similar faux pas with names. When I was living in Brazil for a little bit, there was a guy at the seminary from East Timor who was called Salvador de Deus, or Jesus, and it literally means Savior of Jesus.
Oh, really?
I think his parents meant to say Jesus is Savior, but they ended up naming him Savior of Jesus. So there you go. Okay, what is the most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years for you?
The Formation of the Hebrew Bible by David Carr.
Oh, that's easy. Okay, good one. Here's a question about awkwardness. When you're talking about a biblical passage with somebody and then you notice they start employing a Kabbalistic numerological formula to interpret that passage, what do you do?
Listen, Jewish tradition has, we say that we have 70 facets or faces to the Torah. There are all sorts of lenses that people put on to interpret Scripture for all sorts of pastoral purposes and preaching purposes, and I accept all of them in their own context for what they're designed to do. When someone wants to say to me, "I'm writing for you, Professor Berman, a term paper for this academic course in this university, utilizing the Kabbalah to interpret the biblical passage," I'm like, well, I don't know if that's going to pass muster in this course.
Okay, yeah, you do make a really nice note about numerology in the book. It's a one-off hit and run. I love it. Last question. What idea in biblical studies do you wish would die off, go the way of the dodo bird? We ask everybody this question.
Yeah, I think the belief that we can actually fish out what prior sources looked like in clear resolution. We can see the fissures. We can maybe make some, very low resolution statement, but lacking actual documentary evidence that we pull up from the ground, this idea that we can take the received text and move backwards with clear resolution and recreate what was before, I think it's lacking good methodological basis, in my opinion. That's really what the book is about.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join me with such a vast time zone difference and staying up late with me tonight. I also want to make a note to our listeners that Oxford University Press has offered OnScript listeners a 30% discount on the book for the next couple of weeks, I think. They're going to have at their site, oup.com/academic. Enter the code AAFLYG6, that's Alpha Alpha Fox Lima Yankee Golf 6, at your checkout to get that 30% discount. And thank you again, Dr. Berman, for all the time.
Okay, thank you, Drew. And again, thanks for all of our audience for listening in, and blessings to all of you from the Holy Land.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.